gas lamp flickered once, then steadied. Buck's Row lay silent beneath a sky the colour of wet slate, and the hour had long passed when decent folk walked these stones. Somewhere behind the stable yard, a horse shifted in its stall. The cobbles gleamed with the memory of rain. She walked alone. Mary Ann Nichols moved through the darkness as she had moved through her entire life, without fanfare, without witness, without the protection of name or station. Her bonnet was new, or new enough. She had shown it to a friend only hours before, laughing in the yellow glow of a doss-house kitchen. 4p. That was all she needed. 4p for a bed. She would earn it, she said. She always did. The clock of St. Mary's had not yet struck the half-hour past 3. The air smelled of hops and horse dung and the slow rot of the river. Whitechapel breathed around her, a labyrinth of alleys and shadows and 10,000 souls pressed into too few rooms. And in that darkness, something waited. Not a monster of legend, not a creature of penny dreadfuls, only a man and a knife and silence. Chapter 1. The Parish of Shadows. Good evening and welcome. You have found your way here to this quiet corner of the night, and for that the Bedside Historian is grateful. Wherever you are listening, beneath the covers of your bed, in the stillness of a late hour, or perhaps in some liminal space between waking and dreaming, you are most welcome. Take a moment, if you will, to settle. Let the tensions of your day fall away like old garments. There is no hurry here. There is only the past waiting to be remembered. Before we begin, a gentle request. If you find comfort in these whispered histories, if the darkness and the stillness bring you peace, consider leaving a word of kindness beneath this video. Subscribe, if you have not already, and know that such small gestures help this channel grow. Help these forgotten stories reach other listeners in other quiet rooms, on other sleepless nights. Where are you listening from tonight? What hour has found you here? The Bedside Historian would love to know. Leave your answer in the comments below, a small beacon in the dark, proof that someone else is awake, somewhere, listening to the same whispered truths. Now, let us go backward. Let us descend into the autumn of 1888, into a parish that most respectable Londoners would never visit, into a labyrinth of narrow courts and reeking alleys where the gaslight flickered like a dying pulse. Let us walk together into Whitechapel. The summer had been warm that year, too warm. The streets baked in the August sun, and the smells of the district rose like fever. Horse dung and rotting vegetables, the sharp tang of the tanneries, the sweet, sick odour of the slaughterhouses on Wentworth Street, where blood ran in the gutters and men worked bare-armed among the carcasses of cattle. The Thames lay to the south, a slow grey serpent carrying the filth of the empire toward the sea, and the air that drifted up from the water carried with it the scent of coal smoke and sewage, and the ceaseless industry of the greatest city the world had ever known. But Whitechapel was not the London of postcards and Parliament. It was not the London of Mayfair drawing rooms or Kensington Gardens. It was the other London, the Shadow City, the place where the empire dumped its failures and forgot them. Here, in a square mile of crumbling tenements and common lodging houses, nearly 80,000 souls pressed together in a density that defied comprehension. Families of 8 lived in single rooms. Men slept in shifts, renting a bed for 4 hours at a time. Women sold themselves for the price of a cup of gin, for 4p, for a place to lay their heads when the night grew cold. The streets had names that rolled off the tongue like a dark poetry. Thrall Street, Flower and Dean Street, Dorset Street, Fashion Street, Brick Lane. These were not streets in any proper sense. They were wounds in the city's flesh, narrow passages where the buildings leaned together overhead and the sun rarely touched the cobblestones below. The courts were worse, small enclosed yards accessible only through tunnels barely wide enough for a man to pass, where dozens of families shared a single water pump and a single privy, and the rats moved freely between the walls. Dorset Street was known even then as the worst street in London. The Metropolitan Police walked its length in pairs, and even then not always safely. The lodging houses here charged fourpence a night for a bed in a communal dormitory, eightpence for a double where a woman might bring a companion. The deputy who ran each house enforced only one rule: payment in advance. What happened after that was not his concern. The people of Whitechapel were not, as the newspapers of the West End often implied, a separate species. They were the broken remnants of respectable England, seamstresses whose eyes had failed, soldiers returned from colonial wars with shattered minds, servants dismissed without reference, wives abandoned by husbands who had simply walked away one morning and never returned. They were Irish labourers who had fled the famine decades before and never found their footing. They were Jewish refugees from the pogroms of Russia and Poland, arriving by the thousands in these years, crowding into the already crowded lanes, speaking Yiddish in the markets, setting up tailoring shops in cellars where they worked 18 hours a day for wages that barely covered bread. And they were women, thousands of women. Women without husbands, without families, without any of the protections that Victorian society afforded to those who followed its narrow rules. These women had fallen through the cracks of respectability, and once fallen, there was almost no way to climb back. The workhouse offered a roof, but at the price of freedom and dignity, the uniform dress, the separated families, the endless picking of oakum until the fingers bled. The lodging houses offered freedom but demanded fourpence every night, and for a woman without trade or reference, there were limited ways to earn fourpence in the dark hours. The authorities called them unfortunates. The newspapers called them fallen women. The men who paid for their services called them nothing at all, simply pressed coins into their hands in dark doorways and alleys, and walked away before the deed was fully done. There were, by the estimates of the Metropolitan Police, some 1,200 women walking the streets of Whitechapel in the summer of 1888, selling the only commodity they had left. Most were not young. Most were not beautiful. Most were simply desperate, anaesthetised by gin, hardened by years of poverty, hoping only to survive until morning. The police who patrolled these streets belonged to H Division, headquartered on Leman Street, and they knew every court and alley, every lodging-house deputy, every publican who watered his beer, and every fence who bought stolen goods. They walked their beats with bullseye lanterns and wooden truncheons, and they understood that their role was not to solve the problems of Whitechapel, but merely to contain them. Crime here was constant. Theft, assault, robbery, domestic violence that echoed through the thin walls of the tenements every night. The police made arrests when they could, looked the other way when they had to, and tried to keep the chaos of the East End from spilling over into the respectable districts to the west. The summer of 1888 had already seen violence. In April, a woman named Emma Elizabeth Smith had been attacked on Osborne Street by a gang of men. They had robbed her, beaten her, and violated her with a blunt object. She had managed to walk back to her lodging house, where the deputy found her bleeding and confused. She died the next day in the London hospital of peritonitis, and the police filed her death as a gang assault, one of many in a district where such things were grimly common. In August, another woman died. Martha Tabram, 40 years old, was found on the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings on the morning of August 7th. She had been stabbed 39 times. The wounds were savage, frenzied, clustered around her chest and abdomen. A soldier was briefly suspected. Martha had been seen with 2 soldiers earlier that evening, but no arrest was made. The inquest returned a verdict of willful murder by some person or persons unknown, and the case joined the long list of unsolved Whitechapel crimes. The newspapers took little notice. Violence against women of this class was not news. It was simply the background noise of poverty, the inevitable consequence of lives lived in shadow. The respectable citizens of London did not read about Emma Smith or Martha Tabram over their breakfast tables. They had concerns of their own: the Irish question, the naval estimates, the latest society scandal. Whitechapel was another country, and its dead were buried in unmarked graves and forgotten. But something had changed that summer. Something had shifted in the darkness. The violence against Emma Smith and Martha Tabram was brutal, but it was comprehensible. The work of gangs, of soldiers, of men made savage by drink and opportunity. What was coming was different. What was coming would not fit the familiar patterns. What was coming would force all of London to look, for a moment, into the abyss of its own creation. The last days of August 1888 drifted past in a haze of heat and coal smoke. The hop pickers were leaving for Kent, crowding onto trains at London Bridge, escaping the city for a few weeks of hard labour in the fields. The newspapers reported on the yacht races at Cowes, on the doings of the Prince of Wales, on a railway accident in Scotland. In Whitechapel, the lodging houses filled every night, and the women walked their usual routes. And the police made their usual rounds, and nothing seemed different. But in the darkness of the courts and alleys, something waited. Patient, purposeful, unknown. The night of August 30th was warm. The sky held no stars. In the common kitchen of a lodging house at 18 Thrall Street, a woman sat by the fire showing off her new bonnet to anyone who would admire it. She was 53 years old, though she looked older. Her teeth were missing. Her hair was turning grey. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, though everyone called her Polly, and she had lived many lives before arriving in this place. She had been a wife. She had been a mother. She had been a servant. She had been an inmate of the workhouse. She had been all the things that Victorian England allowed a woman to be, and one by one each of those things had been taken from her. Now she was simply a lodger at 18 Thrall Street, another face in the crowded dormitory, another woman who needed fourpence every night to keep a roof over her head. Tonight she did not have fourpence, but she would get it. She always did. She left the lodging house around 1:30 in the morning, her new bonnet perched on her grey hair, her step only slightly unsteady from the gin she'd consumed. The deputy, a man who had seen 10,000 women pass through his doors, watched her go without comment. She would return or she would not. Either way, her bed would be filled by morning. Polly Nichols walked out into the darkness of Whitechapel, and the night swallowed her whole. The streets at this hour were not empty. They were never truly empty in this district. Men staggered home from the public houses. Women stood in doorways, calling softly to passing figures. Costermongers pushed their barrows toward the early markets. Night soil men made their rounds. The city never slept, not entirely, and Whitechapel least of all. Polly walked east, then north, moving through the familiar geography of her diminished world. She knew these streets as well as she knew her own hands. She knew which corners were safest, which doorways offered shelter, which alleyways to avoid. She had survived here for years, navigating the dangers with the instinct of a creature born to shadow. But tonight, the rules would not apply. Tonight, the darkness held something new. The clock of the church struck 2, then 3. The night deepened around her, and somewhere in that deepening dark, two paths were about to cross. The path of a woman who had lost everything, and the path of a man who had lost something even more fundamental. The parish of shadows held its breath, and waited. Chapter 2. A Blacksmith's Daughter. The year 1845 arrived in London with ladies on the Thames and coal smoke hanging low over the rooftops. Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 8 years, a young woman still, newly married to her German prince, presiding over an empire that was growing larger and more confident with each passing season. The railways were spreading across the countryside like iron vines. The factories of the Midlands roared day and night, and in the cramped ancient lanes around Fleet Street, in the shadow of St. Bride's Church with its wedding cake spire, life went on as it had gone on for centuries, hard, brief, and largely unrecorded. Dawes Court was not a place that appeared on any tourist's itinerary. It was a narrow passage off Shoe Lane, a remnant of medieval London that had somehow survived the Great Fire and the subsequent centuries of rebuilding. The houses here were old, their timbers warped, their walls blackened by generations of coal smoke. The court was home to working people, smiths and printers, bookbinders and charwomen, families who had lived in these lanes for generations, and families who had arrived only yesterday, fleeing the poverty of Ireland or the collapsed industries of the north. Edward Walker was a smith, a man who worked with metal and fire, whose hands were calloused and whose arms were strong from years at the forge. He was not a wealthy man, but he was respectable, a tradesman with a skill that would always be needed, a man who could hold his head up among his neighbours. His wife, whose name has been lost to history, kept their small home as clean as the soot-filled air would allow, and together they raised their children in the way of their class, with strict discipline, firm morality, and the understanding that life offered no charity to those who did not work for their bread. On the 26th of August in that year of 1845, a daughter was born to them. They named her Mary Ann, a good plain English name, a name that carried no pretensions and promised no particular destiny. She was baptised at St. Bride's Church, the ancient parish church of Fleet Street, where the register recorded her arrival in the same careful hand that had recorded thousands of births before and would record thousands more after. Mary Ann Walker. Another soul added to the teeming millions of the greatest city on earth. The London into which Mary Ann was born was a city of savage contrasts. Less than a mile to the west, the grand houses of Mayfair glittered with gaslight and crystal, and ladies in silk gowns descended from carriages to attend balls that cost more than a working family earned in a year. But here, in the lanes around Fleet Street, life was measured in shillings and pence, in the price of bread and coal, in the daily struggle to keep body and soul together. The poor of London lived close to the bone, one illness or one lost job away from the workhouse, and they knew it. They knew it in their blood and in their prayers. Mary Ann's childhood unfolded in this world of narrow margins. She would have learned early to help her mother with the endless domestic labour that consumed a working-class woman's days. The scrubbing, the washing, the mending, the cooking over an open fire, the hauling of water from the pump in the court. She would have learned to navigate the crowded streets, to avoid the horses and carriages, to recognise the signs of danger, the drunk stumbling out of a public house, the gang of boys looking for trouble, the well-dressed gentleman whose interest in a young girl was not to be trusted. Education for a child of her class was a haphazard affair. The state did not yet require children to attend school, and most working families could not spare the pennies for school fees or the labour of a child who could be earning. Mary Ann may have attended a ragged school, one of the charity institutions that offered basic literacy to the children of the poor, or she may have learned her letters from her mother, or she may have learned nothing at all. The records do not say. What is known is that she could read and write, at least a little, which placed her above many of her neighbours and gave her at least a slender hope of respectable employment. The Fleet Street of her childhood was a street of words. The great newspapers had their offices here. The Daily Telegraph, the Morning Advertiser, dozens of smaller publications that fed the insatiable Victorian appetite for news and scandal and opinion. The printing presses ran through the night, and the air smelled of ink and hot metal, and boys ran through the streets with bundles of fresh newspapers under their arms, shouting the headlines to anyone who would listen. This was the industry that would later give Mary Ann her husband, a young man who worked the machines that turned words into print. But that was still years away. In her childhood, Mary Ann was simply one of thousands of girls growing up in the working-class parishes of London, learning the skills that would be expected of her: how to keep a house, how to cook a meal from almost nothing, how to stretch a shilling until it screamed. She learned, too, the strict moral code of her class, the importance of respectability, the terrible fate that awaited women who strayed from the narrow path. A woman's virtue was her only real currency in this world. Once lost, it could never be regained, and the woman who lost it was cast out from decent society forever. The years of her girlhood passed in the rhythm of the seasons. The bitter winters when frost crept up the inside of the windows and the poor burned anything they could find to keep warm. The brief summers when the stench of the city rose to unbearable heights and the cholera came creeping through the crowded courts. She watched neighbours die, watched families broken by illness and poverty, watched women age before their time under the weight of endless childbearing and endless work. This was simply life, as she understood it. This was simply how things were. By the time she reached her 15th birthday in 1860, Mary Ann Walker had become a young woman. The records offer no physical description of her at this age, but later accounts describe a woman of about 5 feet 2 inches, with brown hair and grey eyes, a high forehead and a small scar on her face from some childhood accident. She was not beautiful by the standards of the time, but she was pleasant enough, respectable enough, the sort of young woman who might hope to find a decent husband and establish a decent home. The London of 1860 was a city transformed from the London of her birth. The Great Exhibition of 1851 had announced Britain's supremacy to the world, and the confidence of the age was visible everywhere, in the new buildings rising along the Thames, in the underground railway that had begun to burrow beneath the streets, in the gas lamps that pushed back the darkness and made the night almost safe. The empire was at its zenith, and even the working classes felt a reflected glory, a sense that they were part of something vast and important and eternal. Mary Ann, called Polly by those who knew her, would have felt this too. She would have seen the Crystal Palace, perhaps, or read about it in the newspapers. She would have watched the soldiers marching through the streets, the red coats bright against the grey stone. She would have dreamed, as young women dream, of a future that held more than the narrow lanes of her childhood, more than the endless drudgery of poverty, more than the slow grinding down that she had watched claim her mother and so many others. And in the early years of the new decade, that dream seemed almost possible. She was young, she was respectable, she had skills enough to make herself useful. The future stretched before her, unmarked and full of possibility. She could not possibly know, that the path she would walk would lead her, 43 years later, to a dark street in Whitechapel, to a man with a knife, to a death that would make her name immortal in the annals of horror. But that night was still decades away, for now she was simply Polly Walker, a smith's daughter from Dawes Court, stepping into adulthood in a city that had no particular interest in her fate. The year 1863 brought change. She was 18 now, old enough to marry, old enough to leave her father's house and begin a life of her own. And somewhere in the streets around Fleet Street, in the printing shops and public houses and the Sunday gatherings after church, she met a young man named William Nichols. He was a printer's machinist, a skilled worker in one of the trades that made Fleet Street famous. He was 23 years old, respectable, employed, the sort of man a working-class girl might consider herself fortunate to attract. Their courtship, whatever form it took, has left no trace in the historical record. Perhaps they walked together in the evenings, along the embankment or through the parks. Perhaps they met at church, or at a dance, or through the introduction of mutual friends. What is known is that by the end of 1863, they had decided to marry. It must have seemed to Polly Walker like the beginning of everything she had been raised to want. A husband with a trade, a home of her own, children in time. The respectability that was the highest aspiration of her class. She had done everything right, followed all the rules, and now she was being rewarded with the life that every decent working-class girl hoped for. The banns were read at St. Bride's Church, the ancient church where she had been baptised 18 years before. The neighbours would have known, would have offered their congratulations, would have begun to treat her differently. No longer a girl, but a woman, about to take her place in the adult world. Her father would have given his blessing, perhaps with relief that his daughter was provided for, perhaps with the quiet pride of a man who had raised her well. The wedding was set for January of the new year, 1864, a new beginning, a new life. Polly Walker, standing on the threshold of her future, could not see the shadows that waited ahead. She saw only the light, the candles of the church, the face of her husband-to-be, the promise of a life that would be different from the cramped poverty of Dawes Court. She was young, and the young believe in happy endings. The bells of St. Bride's rang out over Fleet Street, calling the faithful to prayer, marking the hours, counting down the days until Polly Walker would become Polly Nichols, until one life would end and another would begin, and the future waited, patient as a stone, keeping its secrets in the dark. Chapter 3. The Marriage on Bouverie Street. The 16th of January 1864 dawned cold over London. Ice rimmed the edges of the Thames, and the breath of horses rose in white plumes as the carriages rattled through the streets. In the parish of St. Bride's, in the ancient church that had stood since the time of the Normans, two young people prepared to bind their lives together in the sight of God and the law. Mary Ann Walker wore her best dress, whatever that may have been. The records do not say, and the working classes did not often indulge in the white gowns and orange blossoms that graced the weddings of their betters. Her father, Edward Walker, stood beside her, ready to give her away, to transfer her from his protection to the protection of her husband. William Nichols waited at the altar, a young man of 24, his future spread before him like an open road. The ceremony was brief, as such ceremonies always were. The words of the Book of Common Prayer, unchanged for centuries, bound them together as man and wife, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do them part. The register was signed, the fees were paid, and Mary Ann Walker ceased to exist. In her place stood Mary Ann Nichols, a married woman, her identity now subsumed into that of her husband, her legal existence reduced to an extension of his. This was simply how things were in 1864. A married woman could not own property in her own name, could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued. Her earnings belonged to her husband. Her children belonged to her husband. Her very body belonged to her husband, to do with as he pleased. The law offered her no protection against his cruelty, no recourse against his neglect, no escape from a marriage that turned sour. She had made her choice, and she would live with it, for better or for worse, until one of them died. The young couple established their home on Bouverie Street, a short walk from St. Bride's, in the heart of the printing district. It was a respectable address for a respectable young couple, a statement of intent, a declaration that they meant to rise in the world rather than sink. William went to work each day at the printing house, operating the great machines that turned out newspapers and books and pamphlets by the thousand. Polly kept their rooms clean, prepared their meals, performed the endless domestic labour that was a wife's duty and destiny. For a time, perhaps, they were happy. The records offer no insight into the emotional texture of their marriage, no letters or diaries to reveal whether there was love between them, or merely the practical arrangement that so many working-class marriages represented. What is known is that children came, as children always came in that era before reliable contraception, and each child bound them more tightly to each other and to the life they had chosen. The first child, a son, was born in 1866. They named him Edward John, after Polly's father, a gesture of respect and continuity that connected the new family to the old. The birth would have taken place at home, attended by a midwife, or perhaps only by neighbouring women who had experience in such matters. There were no hospitals for ordinary people, no doctors unless something went terribly wrong. Women gave birth as they had always given birth, in pain and blood and danger, and they either survived or they did not. Polly survived. She was young and strong, and Edward John was healthy, and the small family on Bouverie Street had reason to hope. A son was a blessing, an heir, a promise of continuity. William Nichols was now a father, with all the responsibility and pride that entailed. Polly Nichols was now a mother. her purpose in life fulfilled according to the strictest Victorian standards. But motherhood in the working classes was not the sentimental idyll portrayed in the paintings and novels of the age. It was exhausting, relentless work, performed without help in cramped quarters, while also maintaining the household and managing the family's meagre finances. A baby needed constant attention, feeding, changing, soothing through the long nights when colic or teething turned sleep into a distant memory. And even as one child grew, another was likely already on the way. The second child, Percy George, arrived in 1868. Another son, another blessing, another mouth to feed. The rooms on Bouverie Street must have grown crowded now. The domestic labour must have doubled, and Polly, still in her early 20s, must have felt the weight of her responsibilities pressing down upon her. But this was simply life. This was simply what it meant to be a wife and mother in Victorian England, one endured. 1870 brought a daughter, Alice Esther. 3 children now in 4 years of marriage, and Polly was 25 years old, already beginning the slow transformation from young bride to careworn mother that marked so many women of her class. The work never ended. The washing, the cooking, the mending, the cleaning, the nursing of sick children, the management of a household budget that never quite stretched far enough. And always, beneath everything, the knowledge that another pregnancy was likely coming, that her body was not her own, that she would continue to bear children until her body gave out, or her husband lost interest or God decided otherwise. The years between 1870 and 1877 are largely blank in the historical record. The Nichols family continued to live in the Fleet Street area, continued to grow, continued to navigate the daily challenges of working-class existence. William worked, Polly kept house. The children grew from infants to toddlers to children who could be useful, who could run errands and mind younger siblings and contribute in small ways to the household economy. But something was beginning to go wrong. The accounts differ, as accounts always do when a marriage collapses and each party tells their own version of events. William Nichols would later claim that his wife had begun to drink, that she had become unreliable, that she had neglected her duties and driven him to despair. Polly would counter that William had betrayed her, that he had taken up with the nurse who attended her during one of her confinements, that he had broken the marriage vows first and forfeited any right to judge her conduct. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere between these competing narratives. The pressures on a working-class marriage in Victorian England were immense. Money was always tight, living quarters were cramped, exhaustion was constant, and there were few outlets for frustration, few ways to escape the grinding monotony of daily life, few pleasures available to those who could not afford theatres or holidays or the diversions of the wealthy. Drink was one such pleasure. The public houses of London offered warmth and company and temporary oblivion, and they were open to women as well as men, though a woman who drank too much was judged far more harshly than a man who did the same. Gin was cheap, beer was cheaper, and the temporary relief they offered must have seemed worth any price to a woman worn down by years of childbearing and drudgery. Whether Polly Nichols turned to drink as a cause of her marital troubles, or as a consequence of them, the result was the same. The marriage that had begun with such hope in 1864 was crumbling by the mid-1870s. The arguments would have grown louder, the silences longer, the atmosphere in their small home poisoned by resentment and recrimination. The children would have witnessed it all, would have learned early that love could turn to hatred, that promises could be broken, that the future was never as secure as it seemed. In 1877, Eliza Sarah was born, the 4th child. In 1879, Henry Alfred, the 5th. These last 2 children arrived into a household already fracturing, already toxic, their births perhaps the result of marital duty rather than marital affection. By the time Henry Alfred drew his first breath, the marriage was all but over in spirit, even if it continued in law. The legal separation came in 1880 or 1881. The exact date is disputed. What is clear is that Polly left the family home, or was driven from it, and that the children remained with their father. This was the norm in such cases. A woman who left her husband, for whatever reason, forfeited her rights to her children. She became a non-person, erased from the family she'd created, cast out into a world that had no place for a woman alone. Polly Nichols, at 35 years old, found herself starting over. No husband, no children, no home, no references that would allow her to find respectable employment. She had fallen from the narrow ledge of working-class respectability, and the fall would prove to be permanent. The years ahead would take her to the workhouse, to the streets, to the common lodging houses of Whitechapel. They would strip away everything she had been, everything she had hoped to be, until nothing remained but a woman in a dark street, in the small hours of an August morning, waiting for a death she could not imagine. But all of that was still to come, for now, in the early 1880s, she was simply Polly Nichols, alone in London trying to survive. The city swallowed her, as it had swallowed so many others, and the long descent began. In Chapter 4, The Slow Unraveling, the workhouse stood like a fortress against hope. Its walls were high, its windows narrow, its purpose written in every stone. To provide relief to the destitute, yes, but to make that relief so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek it. This was the philosophy of the Poor Law, enshrined in the Great Reform of 1834, and it had created across England a network of institutions designed to punish poverty as much as to alleviate it. Polly Nichols knew these walls well. In the years after her separation from William, she passed through the workhouses of South London with the regularity of the seasons, Lambeth, Wandsworth, the great grim buildings that lined the roads of the Surrey suburbs. Each time she entered, she surrendered what remained of her dignity. Each time she left, she carried with her the mark of pauperism, the invisible brand that separated the deserving from the undeserving in the eyes of respectable society. The routine of the workhouse was designed to crush the spirit. Inmates rose at 6, washed in cold water, attended chapel, and then began the day's labour. For women, this usually meant picking oakum, unravelling old rope fibres until the fingers bled, hour after hour, day after day, for no pay and no purpose, except to demonstrate that relief was not given freely. The food was adequate but grim. Gruel, bread, cheese, occasional meat boiled until it surrendered any flavour it might once have possessed. The dormitories were crowded, the beds narrow, the privacy non-existent. But the worst cruelty of the workhouse was not physical. It was the separation of families, the breaking of bonds that were often the only thing the poor possessed. Husbands were housed apart from wives, children were taken from mothers and raised in separate wards, taught trades if they were boys, domestic service if they were girls, prepared for lives of labour that would keep them just above the poverty line if they were lucky, just below it if they were not. Polly had already lost her children to her husband. The workhouse could take nothing more from her in that regard, but it could take her name, her clothes, her freedom, her sense of herself as a human being with value and possibility. It could reduce her to a number, a case file, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped. She did not stay. She could not stay. Whatever drove her, pride, restlessness, the need for gin, the simple human craving for autonomy, she left the workhouse again and again, trading the grim security of the ward for the uncertain freedom of the streets. She found work when she could, as a domestic servant in respectable households, but these positions never lasted. Her references were poor, her history was spotty, and there was something about her, the drinking perhaps, or the desperation in her eyes, that made employers uneasy. The 1880s unfolded in a blur of movement and loss. She lived in lodging houses when she had money, slept rough when she did not, moved from parish to parish in the endless migration of the destitute. She tried to reconnect with her family. Her father, Edward Walker, still lived in London, and there were moments when she returned to his door. seeking shelter or reconciliation. But these attempts at reunion never lasted. The breach was too wide, the shame too deep, the patterns too fixed. There was a brief period in 1883 or thereabouts when hope flickered again. She found a position as a servant in the household of a family named Cowdery in Wandsworth. The work was honest, the wages were regular, and for a few months it seemed possible that she might rebuild her life, that the long slide might be arrested, that the future might hold something other than poverty and degradation. She wrote to her father during this time. The letter has survived, one of the few direct records of her voice, her thoughts, her hopes. She spoke of her situation with cautious optimism. She was doing well. She was being treated kindly. She hoped that this position would last, that she would be able to save money, that she would prove herself worthy of trust and responsibility. The letter reveals a woman who had not yet given up, who still believed in the possibility of redemption, who still clung to the values of respectability and hard work that she had been raised to honour. It reveals, too, the terrible pressure of her circumstances, the knowledge that one mistake, one slip, one return to old habits would send her tumbling back into the abyss. The position did not last. The reasons are unclear. Perhaps she drank again. Perhaps she was accused of theft. Perhaps she simply could not meet the demands of service after years of degradation. What's known is that by 1887 she was back in the workhouses, back in the lodging houses, back in the slow spiral that led always downward. William Nichols, meanwhile, had continued with his life. He had taken up with another woman, a nurse who may or may not have been the same nurse who had attended Polly during one of her confinements. He was required by law to pay maintenance to his estranged wife, 5 shillings a week, a sum that might have kept her above the waterline if it had been regularly paid. But the payments were irregular, contested, and eventually stopped altogether when William learned that Polly was living as a prostitute. This was the law's logic in 1887. A man was obligated to support his wife, even if they were separated, but not if she was unchaste. Her fall into prostitution, driven by desperation, by the impossibility of finding respectable work, by the need for 4pence to pay for a bed, released him from any further responsibility. She had broken the moral code, and therefore she deserved whatever befell her. The law washed its hands of Mary Ann Nichols, and so did her husband. Her father tried to help in his way. Edward Walker was an old man now, in his 70s, with limited resources and limited patience. He took Polly in when he could, gave her money when he had it, tried to steer her toward sobriety and respectability. But he could not save her. No one could save her. The forces that had brought her to this place were too large, too impersonal, too deeply embedded in the structure of Victorian society. She was not alone in her fate. There were thousands of women like her in London, women who had been wives and mothers, women who had kept respectable homes and raised respectable children, women who had fallen through the cracks and found themselves selling their bodies in the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields and the other dark corners of the East End. The system produced them as surely as the factories produced cloth and the breweries produced beer. They were the waste product of an economy that had no use for women who could not or would not conform to its narrow expectations. By the summer of 1888, Polly Nichols had reached the end of the line. She was 52 years old, though she looked older. Her teeth were mostly gone, victims of poor nutrition and the casual brutality of street life. Her face was weathered, her body worn, her hopes reduced to the simplest possible calculation: how to get through the night, how to earn 4pence, how to find a bed where she could sleep until morning. She was living in the common lodging houses of Whitechapel now, the cheapest and most desperate accommodations the city had to offer. 18 Thrall Street, 56 Flower and Dean Street. These were addresses that respectable Londoners had never heard of, streets that existed in a different dimension from the London of parks and palaces and parliamentary debates. Here, in rooms crowded with iron bedsteads and the smell of unwashed bodies, the lost and the broken found temporary shelter, fourpence at a time. The women who lived in these places formed a community of sorts, bound by their shared circumstances, if not by affection. They looked out for each other, sometimes shared food and drink and information, warned each other about violent clients or dishonest lodging house deputies. They were rivals too, competing for the same limited pool of customers, the same beds, the same scraps of dignity. But they understood each other in ways that no respectable woman could understand, and there was a kind of solidarity in that understanding. Polly made friends in this world, women whose names would later appear in the police reports and newspaper accounts, women with names like Emily Holland and Ellen, women who would be the last to see her alive. These were not deep friendships, perhaps, not the kind of bonds that respectable women formed over tea and needlework, but they were real, in their way, connections forged in the darkness, lifelines thrown across the void. August of 1888 came, hot and heavy, the air thick with the smells of the slaughterhouses and the river. Polly moved through the familiar streets, the familiar routines, the familiar negotiations with men whose faces she would not remember and who would not remember hers. She was drinking more now, the gin a necessary anaesthetic against the reality of her existence. She was tired, bone-tired, in a way that sleep could not cure. But she was still alive. She had survived this long, and she would survive a little longer. She always had. She always did. On the night of August 30th, she went out to earn her fourpence. She had been drinking, but she was not incapacitated. She knew what she was doing, knew the streets, knew the risks. She had done this 1,000 times before. The night was warm. The stars were hidden. The city breathed around her, indifferent to her fate. And somewhere in the darkness, moving through the same streets, walking the same cobblestones, a figure was searching for something. Someone. Anyone. Their paths had not yet crossed, but the night was long, and Whitechapel was small, and the mathematics of tragedy were about to balance. Polly Nichols walked into the dark, her new bonnet on her head, her future measured in hours. She did not know it was ending. She could not know. The night kept its secrets, and she kept walking, and the slow unraveling that had been her life was about to reach its final thread. Chapter 5. The Workhouse Years. The Lambeth Workhouse rose from the South London streets like a monument to despair. Its facade was plain, almost severe, the architecture speaking clearly of its purpose. This was not a place of comfort or charity, but of last resort, a warehouse for human beings who had exhausted every other option. The windows were small and set high in the walls, admitting light but not hope. The entrance was forbidding, designed to make the act of seeking help feel like an act of surrender. And for the men and women who passed through its doors, surrender was precisely what was required. Polly Nichols knew this entrance well. She had crossed its threshold more times than she could count in the years between her separation from William and her final arrival in Whitechapel. The workhouse was not a single experience, but a recurring nightmare, a place she escaped from and returned to with the grim predictability of the tide. Each time she entered, she told herself it would be the last. Each time she left, she believed she had finally broken free, and each time the streets proved harder than she remembered, and the workhouse doors swung open once again. The admission process was designed to strip away identity. Inmates surrendered their clothes, their possessions, their names. They were bathed, examined for disease, assigned a number and a uniform. The shapeless grey dress for women, the rough grey suit for men. They were classified according to age and condition, the able-bodied who would work, the infirm who would not, the children who would be educated in the ways of their betters and taught to be grateful for the charity they received. Polly was classified as able-bodied, which meant she was expected to earn her keep. The work assigned to women in the Lambeth workhouse was monotonous and punishing. Scrubbing floors, washing laundry, picking oakum. The oakum picking was the worst, a task that seemed designed specifically to break the spirit. Old rope, tarred and stiff, had to be unravelled fibre by fibre, the sharp strands cutting into fingers already raw from previous days' labour. The work served no purpose except to demonstrate that relief was not free, that the poor must pay for their poverty with pain. The days began before dawn. A bell rang through the dormitories at 6, summoning the inmates from their narrow beds to face another day of regulated misery. There was no privacy in the workhouse. The dormitories held dozens of beds, arranged in rows, and every bodily function was performed in view of others. The meals were taken in a great hall, in silence. The food ladled out in portions calculated to sustain life but not to satisfy hunger. Gruel for breakfast, bread and cheese for dinner, soup for supper, thin and flavourless, with occasional lumps of potato or turnip floating in the grey liquid. The silence was enforced with particular rigour. Inmates were not permitted to speak during meals, during work, during the long hours of the evening before the dormitory lights were extinguished. This rule, like so many others, was intended to discourage the formation of friendships, the sharing of complaints, the development of any sense of community that might make the workhouse bearable. The poor were to be isolated even in their multitudes, each one alone with their shame. Polly endured this regime again and again throughout the 1880s. The records of her admissions are incomplete, scattered across multiple institutions and multiple parishes, but the pattern is clear. She would enter the workhouse in desperation, stay for weeks or months, and then discharge herself, choosing the uncertainty of the streets over the crushing routine of the ward. She would find work sometimes as a charwoman or domestic servant, and for a time she would manage. Then something would go wrong. She would drink, she would lose her position, she would run out of money, and the workhouse would reclaim her. The Mitcham workhouse received her in 1882, or perhaps 1883. Mitcham was smaller than Lambeth, serving a more rural population, but the regime was the same. The grey uniform, the silent meals, the endless picking of oakum. The guardians of the poor, the local worthies who administered the workhouse on behalf of the parish, looked upon their charges with a mixture of pity and contempt. These were the failures of society, the men and women who had not managed to keep themselves above water, and their failure was assumed to be moral as much as economic. If they had worked harder, saved more, drunk less, they would not be here. Their poverty was their own fault. This was the doctrine of the age, preached from pulpits and published in newspapers and enshrined in law. The deserving poor, the widow, the orphan, the worker struck down by illness through no fault of his own, might merit sympathy and assistance, but the undeserving poor, the drunk, the idle, the woman of the loose morals, deserved nothing but the harshest treatment. The workhouse existed to help them, yes, but also to punish them, to make their lives so unpleasant that they would do anything to escape. Polly was classified by this logic among the undeserving. She drank. She had left her husband or been driven from him. She had failed to maintain respectable employment. She had, by the standards of Victorian morality, brought her troubles upon herself, and therefore she deserved whatever she suffered. The guardians who administered her relief did so grudgingly, with constant reminders of her unworthiness, with rules and restrictions designed to remind her that she was receiving charity, not justice. The Edmonton workhouse received her later, in 1887 or thereabouts. By this time she was in her early 40s, the years of poverty and drink beginning to show on her face and body. She was no longer the young woman who had married William Nichols in the hopeful January of 1864. She was worn, faded, her teeth beginning to fail, her hair turning grey. The matron who admitted her would have seen 100 women just like her, would have processed her with the efficiency of long practice, would have assigned her a bed and a number, and forgotten her before the ink was dry. But even in the workhouse, even in the depths of her degradation, Polly retained something of herself. The records show that she was not entirely broken, not entirely passive. She discharged herself repeatedly, choosing freedom over security, choosing the streets over the ward. This was not necessarily a wise choice. The streets were dangerous, unpredictable, and the workhouse at least offered food and shelter. But it was a choice, an assertion of agency in a life that had stripped away almost every other form of control. There were moments of hope, even in these years. The position with the Cowdray family in Wandsworth, which lasted for several months in 1887, seemed to offer a path back to respectability. Polly wrote to her father during this time, expressing optimism about her situation, speaking of her employer's kindness, hinting at the possibility of a better future. The letter suggests a woman who had not entirely given up, who still believed that redemption was possible, who still hoped that the next chapter of her life might be different from the ones that had come before. But the position did not last. By July of 1887, she was gone, the reasons unrecorded. Perhaps she drank again. Perhaps she stole something, or was accused of stealing. Perhaps she simply could not maintain the discipline required of domestic service after years of irregular living. The workhouse records show her readmitted within months, the brief dream of respectability extinguished. The familiar grey uniform waiting for her like an old enemy. The cycle continued through the autumn and winter of 1887, through the spring of 1888, in and out of the workhouse. Brief periods of freedom followed by inevitable return. The lodging houses of South London knew her, then the lodging houses of the East End. She drifted eastward, following some current invisible to those who lived above the waterline, moving toward Whitechapel with the inexorability of water flowing downhill. By May of 1888 she had arrived. The workhouse at Lambeth had discharged her for the last time, or perhaps she had simply stopped returning. The common lodging houses of Whitechapel offered a different kind of existence. Harder in some ways, freer in others. Here there were no guardians to judge her, no matrons to enforce silence, no bells to regulate her days. Here she was responsible only for herself, for earning the fourpence that would buy her a bed, for surviving from one night to the next. The lodging houses of Whitechapel were a world unto themselves. They operated outside the respectable economy, serving a population that respectable society preferred not to acknowledge. The buildings were old, poorly maintained, their rooms subdivided and subdivided again until a space meant for one family held dozens of strangers. The beds were narrow iron frames arranged in rows, the mattresses thin and often verminous. The kitchens were communal, the fires always burning, the air thick with smoke and the smell of cooking and unwashed bodies. But there was a kind of community here that the workhouse had forbidden. The lodgers talked to each other, shared food and drink, formed alliances and rivalries and friendships. They were not inmates but customers, free to come and go as they pleased, free to spend their evenings in the public houses or the streets, free to live as they chose as long as they paid their fourpence. This freedom was illusory in many ways. They were still trapped by poverty, still subject to violence and exploitation, still at the mercy of forces beyond their control, but it felt like freedom, and for Polly Nichols, after years in the workhouse, that feeling was worth something. She settled into the rhythms of this new life. The days were her own, to sleep, or wander, or seek work. The nights were for earning, for walking the streets in search of men who would pay for her company. It was dangerous work, degrading work, but it was work she controlled, at least in part. She chose her clients, chose her prices, chose when to work and when to rest. The workhouse had taught her that there were worse things than prostitution. There were worse things than poverty. There was the loss of all choice, all agency, all selfhood. The streets, for all their dangers, at least allowed her to remain herself. The summer of 1888 deepened around her. June, July, August. The heat rose from the cobblestones, and the smells of Whitechapel intensified, and the nights grew shorter and warmer. She moved between lodging houses, Thrall Street, Flower and Dean Street, following the availability of beds and the fluctuations of her meagre income. She made friends among the other women who walked the streets, women who understood her situation because they shared it. She was surviving, that was all, not thriving, not improving, not climbing back toward the respectability she had lost. Simply surviving day by day, night by night, fourpence by fourpence. The workhouse years had taught her that survival was not guaranteed, that the abyss was always waiting, that she could fall further than she had already fallen. But they had also taught her that she was capable of enduring, that she had reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. The last days of August arrived, hot and heavy, the air thick with the smells of the slaughterhouses and the river. Polly Nichols had no way of knowing that her story was about to end, that the survival she had fought for was about to be taken from her. She knew only that the night was coming, and she needed fourpence, and she would go out and earn it, as she had done 1,000 times before. The workhouse years were behind her now. The grey uniform, the silent meals, the endless oakum. She had escaped finally, permanently. She had chosen the streets over the ward, freedom over security, herself over the system that had tried to break her. It was not much of a victory, but it was hers, and she carried it with her into the darkness of her final night. Chapter 6. The Last Address, 18. Thrall Street stood in the heart of Whitechapel, a narrow building in a narrow lane, its bricks darkened by decades of coal smoke, its windows clouded with grime. The street itself was barely wide enough for a cart to pass, the buildings on either side leaning toward each other like conspirators sharing a secret. During the day, the lane bustled with the commerce of poverty, costermongers selling bruised fruit, children running errands, women hanging laundry from windows that never fully closed. At night, it took on a different character, the shadows deepening, the gaslight barely reaching the corners where transactions of various kinds were conducted in whispered negotiations. The lodging house at number 18 was one of dozens in the immediate area, all serving the same desperate population, all operating on the same simple principle. Fourpence for a bed, payment in advance, no questions asked. The deputy who ran the house was a man accustomed to his clientele, accustomed to their poverty and their vices and their irregular hours. He asked nothing of his lodgers except money. What they did to earn that money was not his concern. Polly Nichols had been staying at Thrall Street since some time in the early summer of 1888. The exact date of her arrival is lost to history, subsumed in the larger anonymity of a lodging-house life. She was one of perhaps 30 or 40 women who passed through those doors each night, one face among many, her story unremarkable in a place where every story was a variation on the same theme of loss and survival. The accommodation was basic in the extreme. The dormitories held rows of iron bedsteads, each one narrow enough to discourage the bringing of companions, each one equipped with a thin mattress and a thinner blanket. The sheets, when they were provided at all, were changed infrequently. The smell of the rooms was a permanent feature, the accumulated odour of bodies and cooking and coal smoke, and the particular mustiness of buildings that never quite dried out. But the beds were better than the streets, better than the doorways and the arches where those without fourpence spent their nights, and for that they were worth the price. The communal kitchen was the social heart of the establishment. Here, the lodgers gathered around a central fire, cooking whatever food they had managed to procure, sharing news and gossip, seeking warmth and company in equal measure. The conversations that took place in these kitchens were rarely recorded. The poor leave few written traces of their inner lives, but they can be imagined easily enough. Talk of work and the lack of it. Talk of men and their cruelties. Talk of the police and the prices and the weather. The small talk of survival, repeated night after night, the same concerns in different mouths. Polly knew the other women in the kitchen. She knew their faces, their names, their circumstances. There was a woman named Ellen, whose surname has been lost. There was Emily Holland, called Nellie, who would later be among the last people to see Polly alive. There were others, dozens of others, a shifting population of women bound together by their shared address and their shared profession, and their shared understanding of what it meant to be at the bottom of Victorian society. These were not close friendships for the most part. The lodging house life did not encourage deep attachments. People came and went, died or moved on or simply disappeared, and it was unwise to invest too much emotion in connections that might be severed at any moment. But there was a kind of solidarity among the women, a mutual recognition, a willingness to share information and warnings that might mean the difference between safety and danger. They looked out for each other, in their way, because no one else would. The summer of 1888 had already seen violence against women in Whitechapel. The attack on Emma Smith in April, the murder of Martha Tabram in August. These events were known to the women who walked the streets, discussed in the lodging house kitchens, filed away as additional evidence of the dangers they faced every night. But violence was not new to them. Violence was simply part of the landscape, as familiar as the cobblestones and the gas lamps and the smell of the brewery. They had all experienced it in one form or another. They all knew women who had been beaten, robbed, worse. It was the price of the life they led, and they paid it because they had no other choice. Polly's daily routine, such as it was, revolved around the simple economics of survival. She needed fourpence each night to pay for her bed. She needed additional money for food, for drink, for the small necessities that made life bearable. The arithmetic was brutal. A few minutes with a client might earn her enough for a bed, or it might not, depending on the client and the hour and her own powers of negotiation. A good night might leave her with money to spare. A bad night might leave her wandering the streets until dawn, waiting for the morning when the day kitchens would offer bread and tea to those who had nothing. She supplemented her income with casual work when she could find it, charring, washing, any of the irregular employments available to a woman without references or regular address. But such work was scarce and poorly paid, and it could not be counted on. The streets were more reliable in their way. There were always men looking for what she was selling, even in the worst times. The transaction was simple, direct, requiring no references, no character, nothing but the willingness to perform and the negotiation of a price. August had been a difficult month. The records do not specify why, but the patterns of poverty are predictable enough. Perhaps work had been scarce. Perhaps she had drunk more than usual. Perhaps she had been ill, or had suffered one of the countless small setbacks that could derail a life lived so close to the margin. What is known is that by the end of the month she was moving between lodging houses, staying at Thrall Street some nights, and at the White House on Flower and Dean Street on others. Her situation precarious even by the standards of Whitechapel. Flower and Dean Street was, if anything, worse than Thrall Street. It was known throughout London as one of the most dangerous addresses in the city, a street where the police walked in pairs and respectable citizens never ventured. The lodging houses here were rougher, the clientele more desperate, the violence more common. But the beds were the same price, and when a woman could not pay at one address, she might find credit at another, and so the geography of poverty shifted and flowed like water seeking its level. The last week of August found Polly in reasonably good spirits, or so the later testimony would suggest. She had acquired a new bonnet, a small luxury that she showed off to her friends with evident pleasure. The bonnet was nothing special by the standards of respectable society, a simple affair, probably second-hand, possibly stolen. But to Polly, it represented something more than its material value. It was a sign that she was still herself, still capable of caring about her appearance, still connected to the world of ordinary concerns. A woman who bought a new bonnet was a woman who believed in tomorrow. The night of August 30th, 1888, began like any other. The sun set over London, the gas lamps flickered to life, and the streets of Whitechapel filled with their nocturnal population. Polly spent the early evening in the kitchen at Thrall Street, talking with the other lodgers, drinking gin, showing off her bonnet to anyone who would admire it. She was in good humour by all accounts, laughing and joking, her mood lighter than her circumstances might have warranted. But as the evening wore on, a familiar problem emerged. She did not have her fourpence. She had spent what money she had on drink perhaps, or she had simply failed to earn enough during the day. The deputy at Thrall Street was sympathetic but firm. No money, no bed. Those were the rules, and they applied to everyone regardless of how long they had stayed or how well they were known. Polly would have to go out and earn her keep, or find somewhere else to sleep. She was not alarmed by this development. It had happened before, many times. She knew what to do, knew the streets, knew how to find a client and negotiate a price. She told the deputy not to worry, that she would be back soon with her fourpence. She was confident, even cheerful. She had her new bonnet after all. She would earn her money easily enough. The clock showed 1:30 in the morning when she left the lodging house. The streets were quiet but not empty. There were always people about in Whitechapel, at every hour of the day and night. She walked eastward toward the darker streets where business might be conducted with less interference, where the shadows were deep enough to provide a measure of privacy. An hour later, around 2:30, she encountered Emily Holland on the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. The two women knew each other from the lodging houses and they stopped to talk. Holland later testified that Polly was drunk but not incapacitated, that she was leaning against a wall but able to walk and speak clearly. Polly told her friend that she had earned her DOS money 3 times over that night but had drunk it all away. She was going to try once more, she said. Just one more client and she would have enough to buy her bed. Holland urged her to come back to the lodging house, to give up for the night, to sleep in the kitchen if she could not afford a bed. But Polly refused. She would earn her fourpence. She always did. The clock of St. Mary's Church struck 2:30. The two women parted. Emily Holland walked toward Thrall Street. Polly Nichols walked in the opposite direction, toward Whitechapel Road, toward the darkness, toward whatever fate was waiting for her. She was never seen alive again by anyone who knew her name. The last address of Mary Ann Nichols was not Thrall Street or Flower and Dean Street. It was a dark stretch of cobblestones called Buck's Row, a quiet street in a quiet corner of Whitechapel, where the warehouses blocked the gaslight and the silence was complete. She walked there alone, in the small hours of the morning, her new bonnet still perched on her grey hair, and there, in the darkness, her story ended. Chapter 7. The Final Hours. The night of August 30th turned into the morning of August 31st without ceremony. There was no clear boundary, no moment of transition, only the slow wheeling of the stars above the coal smoke and the gradual deepening of the darkness in the streets below. London slept, or pretended to sleep, while in its hidden corners, the business of the night continued, the drinking and the fighting, the buying and the selling, the 1,000 small transactions that kept the machinery of poverty grinding on. Polly Nichols walked through this darkness with the familiarity of long practice. She knew these streets the way a sailor knows the sea, reading their currents and their dangers by instinct, navigating by landmarks invisible to those who did not belong. The gin she had consumed earlier in the evening had worn off somewhat, leaving behind the dull headache and the heightened awareness that follow intoxication. She was not drunk now, or not very drunk. She was simply tired and determined and focused on the simple goal that had driven her out into the night. Fourpence. That was all she needed. Fourpence for a bed at Thrall Street. Fourpence for a few hours of sleep before the sun rose and the whole cycle began again. She had earned it 3 times over already tonight, according to what she had told Emily Holland, but she had spent it on drink, and now she had nothing. This was the pattern of her life, the eternal return of need and satisfaction, and need again, the wheel that never stopped turning. The streets she walked were not empty, but they were emptier than they had been earlier in the evening. The public houses had closed at midnight, disgorging their final customers into the lanes, and most of those had found their way home, or to their lodging houses, or to whatever corner would shelter them until morning. The women who worked the streets were thinning out too, the night's commerce winding down, the competition for clients growing fiercer as the hours passed. Only the most desperate remained, the women who had not earned enough, the women who had spent what they had earned, the women for whom failure tonight meant sleeping in a doorway or worse. Polly was among them. She moved through the streets with purpose, her eyes scanning for potential clients, her ears alert for the sound of footsteps behind her. She had done this so many times that the actions had become automatic, the wariness second nature. Whitechapel at night was dangerous. Everyone knew that. But the danger was manageable if you knew the rules. You did not go down blind alleys. You did not go with men who seemed violent or strange. You kept your wits about you, stayed where you could be heard if you screamed, and trusted your instincts when something felt wrong. The problem was that tonight, nothing felt wrong. The night was quiet, almost peaceful. The heat of the day had faded, leaving behind a pleasant coolness, a relief after the sweltering weeks of August. The streets were familiar, the shadows unthreatening. Polly had no reason to be more cautious than usual, no premonition of danger, no warning from any of the senses that had kept her alive this long. She walked eastward, away from the busier thoroughfares, toward the quieter streets where business could be conducted without interference. This was standard practice, part of the negotiation between the women and the police. Stay away from the main roads, keep the trade out of sight, and the constables would look the other way. The women knew which streets were safe for this purpose, which doorways and alleys offered shelter from observation, which corners were watched and which were not. The time was now approaching 3 o'clock in the morning. The night was at its darkest, the hour when human vitality reaches its lowest ebb, when the body craves sleep and the mind grows slow. Polly was tired, deeply tired, the kind of exhaustion that accumulates over years of irregular living and insufficient rest. But she could not stop, not yet. She needed her fourpence, and she would not rest until she had it. The encounter, when it came, has left no trace in the historical record. No witness saw Polly Nichols meet the man who would kill her. No one heard them speak, saw them negotiate, watched them walk together toward the place where she would die. The darkness of Whitechapel swallowed them both, and what passed between them in those final minutes remains a mystery that has never been solved. What is known is that sometime between 3 o'clock and 3:30, Polly Nichols walked into Buck's Row. This was a narrow street, not quite an alley, but not a proper thoroughfare either, running between Whitechapel Road and Brady Street. On one side stood a row of terrace houses, their inhabitants asleep behind closed shutters. On the other side loomed the dark mass of warehouses and stables, their doors locked, their windows black. The street had no gas lamps, or none that were lit at this hour, and the darkness was nearly complete. It was not a street Polly would have chosen for business. It was too dark, too isolated, too far from help if something went wrong, but perhaps she did not choose it. Perhaps she was led there, or followed there, or simply found herself there in the aimless wandering of a woman too tired to think clearly. The mechanics of those final minutes are lost, and will remain lost, and all that survives is the terrible evidence of what happened next. At approximately 3:40 in the morning, a carman named Charles Cross was walking to work. His route took him along Buck's Row, a street he knew well, a street he walked every morning in the darkness before dawn. The Cross family had lived in this neighbourhood for years, and Charles was familiar with every cobblestone, every doorway, every turning. He walked quickly, his mind perhaps on the day ahead, his eyes adjusting to the darkness that was just beginning to lighten toward the east. He saw her first as a shape, a bundle, something lying against the gates of a stable yard on the south side of the street. His first thought was that it was a tarpaulin, discarded or blown there by the wind. His second thought, as he drew closer, was that it was a woman, drunk perhaps, or sleeping rough. Such sights were not uncommon in Whitechapel. The streets were full of people who had nowhere else to go. He stopped. He looked more closely. The shape resolved itself into a woman lying on her back, her skirts pushed up around her waist, her legs extended toward the street. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. Her face was pale in the darkness, pale as paper, pale as death. Cross hesitated. He was not a brave man, not a coward either, simply an ordinary working man confronted with something outside his experience. He did not know what to do. He thought perhaps the woman was dead, but he was not certain. He thought perhaps he should help her, but he did not want to touch her. He stood there, frozen by indecision, as the seconds ticked past. Then he heard footsteps. Another man was approaching along Bucks Row, another workman on his way to the early shift. This was Robert Paul, a carman-like cross, a stranger who happened to be walking the same route at the same hour. Cross called out to him, his voice low, urgent. "Come and look at this woman." Paul approached. He too saw the figure on the ground, the pale face, the open eyes. He knelt beside her, touched her hands, found them cold. He put his ear to her chest, listening for a heartbeat. He thought he detected something, a faint flutter, the ghost of life still clinging to the body, but he was not certain. It was dark, and he was frightened, and he did not know what he was hearing. The two men conferred in whispers. They should find a policeman, they agreed. They should report what they had found. They did not want to be involved, did not want to be suspected, did not want to be late for work, but they could not simply walk away and leave her there. Even in Whitechapel, even among the poor, there were standards of decency that had to be maintained. They pulled her skirts down, covering her exposed legs. It seemed the decent thing to do. Then they walked away, toward Whitechapel Road, looking for a constable. They found one within minutes. Police Constable Jonas Misen, walking his beat on Baker's Row. They told him what they had found, a woman lying in Bucks Row, possibly dead. He should go and see. Misen went. But he was not the first policeman to reach the body. That distinction belonged to Police Constable John Neal, who was walking his beat along Bucks Row itself, and who discovered the body independently, just minutes after Cross and Paul had left. Neal had a bullseye lantern, and he shone it on the woman's face, on her throat, on the dark pool that was spreading beneath her on the cobblestones. What he saw made him blow his whistle for assistance. The woman's throat had been cut. Not once, but twice. Deep gashes that had severed the windpipe and the major blood vessels, wounds so severe that the head was nearly detached from the body. The blood had poured out onto the street, black in the lantern light, still warm to the touch. She'd been dead for only a few minutes, perhaps less, when Neal found her. The constable's whistle brought other officers running. Within minutes, Bucks Row was full of police, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the walls, their voices low and urgent as they secured the scene and sent for a doctor. The neighbourhood was waking now, aroused by the commotion, faces appearing at windows, doors opening to reveal curious residents in their nightclothes. Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn arrived at approximately 4 o'clock. He was a local physician, accustomed to being called out at all hours, accustomed to the violence and the poverty of Whitechapel. But even he was shocked by what he found in Bucks Row. The wounds were savage, deliberate, the work of someone who knew how to use a knife. He pronounced the woman dead, noted the apparent cause of death, and ordered the body removed to the mortuary. It was only later, at the mortuary, that the full extent of the injuries was discovered. The killer had not stopped at cutting her throat. He had also mutilated her abdomen, inflicting wounds that spoke of something beyond simple murder, something methodical and terrible. The details were not released to the public, not immediately, but they would emerge soon enough, and they would change the nature of the investigation forever. But that morning, in the first grey light of dawn, all that was known was that a woman had been murdered in Bucks Row. Her name was not yet known. Her history was not yet known. She was simply another victim, another casualty of the violence that plagued the East End, another body to be processed and buried and forgotten. In the lodging house at Thrall Street, the deputy noted that Polly Nichols had not returned. Her bed had been given to someone else, as the rules required. No one thought much of it. Women disappeared all the time in Whitechapel. They moved to other lodging houses, or they found somewhere else to stay, or they simply vanished into the vast anonymity of the city. Polly would turn up, or she would not. Either way, life would go on. The sun rose over London. The streets filled with the traffic of another day. And in a mortuary in Whitechapel, a woman with a new bonnet and no name waited for someone to claim her. The final hours of Mary Ann Nichols had ended. The autumn of terror had begun. Chapter 8. Bucks Row. The street lay quiet in the moments before discovery. A narrow passage between the sleeping houses and the silent warehouses, a forgotten corridor in the labyrinth of Whitechapel. Bucks Row was not a street that anyone would remember under ordinary circumstances. It had no particular history, no notable residents, no reason for anyone beyond its immediate neighbours to know its name. It was simply one of hundreds of such streets in the East End, a functional space connecting one thoroughfare to another, unremarkable in every way. But in the early hours of August 31st, 1888, Bucks Row became something else. It became a crime scene, a mystery, a name that would echo through the decades and centuries that followed. It became the place where the terror began, the first scene in a drama that would grip London and the world, the opening act of a nightmare that has never fully ended. The stable gates where Polly Nichols lay belonged to a man named Brown, who kept horses there for his business. The gates were wooden, painted dark, set into a wall that separated the stable yard from the street. During the day, carts and wagons passed through these gates regularly, the commerce of the neighbourhood flowing past without notice. At night, the gates were closed and locked, the yard silent, the horses sleeping in their stalls. It was against these gates that Polly's body came to rest. She lay on her back, her arms at her sides, her legs extended toward the centre of the street. Her eyes were open, staring upward at the sky she could no longer see. Her bonnet, the new bonnet she had been so proud of, had fallen from her head and lay beside her on the cobblestones. Her skirts had been pushed up, exposing her legs, a detail that the first witnesses found disturbing enough to correct before they went for help. The blood had pooled beneath her, spreading outward from the terrible wounds in her throat, soaking into the gaps between the cobblestones, black and gleaming in the darkness. The quantity of blood was remarkable, even to men accustomed to the slaughterhouses of Whitechapel. It suggested that her heart had still been beating when the wounds were inflicted, pumping out her life onto the street in great arterial gushes. She had not been dead long. The blood was still warm when the police arrived. Police Constable John Neal had been walking his beat along Bucks Row for years. He knew every doorway, every turning, every shadow. His route was fixed, timed to the minute, designed to ensure that every part of his territory was observed at regular intervals. He had passed through Bucks Row approximately 30 minutes before discovering the body, and he had seen nothing. The street had been empty, quiet, unremarkable. Whatever had happened to Polly Nichols had happened in that narrow window of time, in the darkness between one patrol and the next. Neil's lantern revealed what the darkness had hidden. The wounds to the throat were immediately visible, two deep cuts that had opened the neck from ear to ear, severing everything in their path. The cuts were clean, precise, the work of a sharp blade wielded with confidence. There was no hesitation in these wounds, no tentative first strokes followed by deeper ones. The killer had known what he was doing. He had done it before, or he had thought about doing it for a very long time. The constable's whistle brought assistance within minutes. Police Constable John Thane arrived first, followed by others, their footsteps echoing in the narrow street, their lanterns creating a pool of light around the body. The neighbours were waking now, aroused by the noise, their faces appearing at windows, their voices calling out questions that the police could not yet answer. What had happened? Who was she? Was she dead? Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn arrived at the scene at approximately 4 o'clock. He was a local surgeon, his practice located on Whitechapel Road, and he was accustomed to being summoned at unusual hours. The police often called upon him to examine bodies, to pronounce death, to offer his professional opinion on wounds and causes. He had seen violence before, had seen the damage that human beings could inflict upon one another in moments of rage or desperation. But even he found the scene in Bucks Row disturbing. He examined the body briefly, there in the street, by the light of the police lanterns. He noted the throat wounds, the cooling of the extremities, the fixed and dilated pupils. He estimated that she had been dead for no more than half an hour, perhaps less. He noted that the legs were still warm, that the body had not yet begun to stiffen. He ordered the body removed to the mortuary, where a more thorough examination could be conducted. The mortuary was located in the yard of the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary, a grim building on Old Montague Street. It was not a proper mortuary by modern standards, simply a shed really, with a table and some basic equipment, a place where the dead of the workhouse and the streets could be stored until burial. The body of Polly Nichols was carried there on an ambulance, a wheeled stretcher pushed through the streets that were just beginning to fill with the early morning traffic. It was at the mortuary that the full horror was revealed. 2 workhouse attendants, men named Robert Mann and James Hatfield, were tasked with stripping the body for examination. They performed this duty without supervision, without any police officer present, a procedural failure that would later be criticised at the inquest. As they removed Polly's clothing, they discovered what the darkness of Bucks Row had concealed. Her abdomen had been mutilated. A long, jagged wound ran down the centre of her belly, deep enough to expose the intestines. Several other cuts had been made, seemingly at random, slashing across the flesh without apparent purpose. These wounds had not been visible in the street because her clothing had covered them, the blood absorbed by the layers of fabric. But here, under the harsh light of the mortuary, they were unmistakable. Dr. Llewellyn was summoned again to examine these new findings. He noted the wounds with professional detachment, measuring their length and depth, assessing the instrument that might have caused them. The knife, he concluded, must have been strong and sharp, with a blade at least 6 to 8 inches long. The wounds had been inflicted with considerable force, suggesting a killer with some anatomical knowledge, or at least a willingness to explore the human body with a blade. The implications were troubling. This was not an ordinary murder, not a robbery gone wrong, or a domestic dispute turned fatal. The mutilation suggested something else entirely, a deliberate desecration, a ritualistic quality, a purpose beyond simple killing. The killer had not been content to take Polly Nichols' life. He had wanted to do something more, something that spoke of obsession or rage or a darkness that ordinary language could not capture. The news spread through Whitechapel with the speed of rumour. By mid-morning, the streets were buzzing with talk of the murder, the crowds gathering at the entrance to Bucks Row, the curious pressing forward for a glimpse of the spot where the body had been found. The newspapers had not yet published their accounts, but word of mouth was faster than print, and the details, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated, passed from person to person, growing more sensational with each telling. The police began their investigation immediately, though investigation is perhaps too generous a term for the haphazard efforts of those first hours. The crime scene had not been properly secured. The body had been moved and stripped without adequate supervision. The witnesses had been allowed to go about their business before giving full statements. The failures were not deliberate, not the result of incompetence or indifference, but simply the consequence of a system not designed for crimes of this nature. The police of H Division were accustomed to dealing with common violence, brawls, robberies, domestic assaults. They had no procedures for what they were now facing. Inspector John Spratling took charge of the initial inquiry. He visited the mortuary, examined the body, noted the wounds. He ordered a search of the area around Bucks Row, looking for the weapon, for bloodstains, for any evidence that might point to the killer. He interviewed the witnesses, Cross and Paul, the 2 carmen who had discovered the body, and the constables who had responded to their call. He sent officers to the lodging houses of the neighbourhood, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. The identification of the victim took time. Polly Nichols carried no papers, no documents that might reveal her name. Her clothing bore no marks, no labels that might indicate where she had purchased it, or who she was. She was simply a woman, middle-aged, poorly dressed, one of thousands who might have been found dead on any street in Whitechapel on any morning. The police distributed descriptions, hoping that someone would come forward to identify her. The break came from the mortuary itself. Among Polly's clothing was a petticoat, and on that petticoat was stamped the mark of the Lambeth workhouse. The police contacted Lambeth, and the workhouse records revealed name, Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly, formerly of various addresses in South London, most recently residing in the common lodging houses of Whitechapel. With a name came a history. Polly's father, Edward Walker, was located and brought to the mortuary to identify the body. The old man looked down at the face of his daughter, at the grey hair and the missing teeth, and the terrible wounds that had ended her life. He confirmed her identity. He told the police what he knew of her recent years, the separation from her husband, the drift into poverty, the drinking, the streets. He was not surprised, he said, that she had come to this end. He had warned her. He had tried to help her. But there was only so much a father could do. William Nichols, Polly's estranged husband, was also located and questioned. He had not seen his wife in years, he said. He had stopped paying her maintenance when he learned of her way of life. He expressed no grief, no remorse, only a kind of weary resignation. She had made her choices, and now she'd paid for them. That was all there was to say. The inquest was scheduled for the following day, to be held at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road. The body would remain in the mortuary until then, waiting for the formal proceedings that would record the manner of her death and launch the official investigation. The newspapers were preparing their accounts, the illustrators sketching the scene, the editors writing headlines that would appear in the morning editions. Bucks Row itself returned to something like normality. The blood on the cobblestones was washed away, diluted by buckets of water poured by the residents, scrubbed with brushes until no trace remained. The stable gates were opened for business as usual, the horses led out, the carts loaded and driven away. Life went on, as it always did in Whitechapel, the rhythms of poverty and commerce reasserting themselves over the intrusion of death. But something had changed. The residents of Bucks Row knew it, the police knew it, the newspapers knew it. This murder was different from the others, different from Emma Smith and Martha Tabram, different from the countless acts of violence that marked life in the East End. The savagery of the wounds, the precision of the cuts, the mysterious circumstances, all of it pointed to something new, something that did not fit the familiar patterns. The word had not yet been coined, the name had not yet been given. But the shadow was falling over Whitechapel, and it would not lift for many years to come. The terror had begun on Bucks Row, in the darkness of a late August night, with the death of a woman named Polly Nichols, and somewhere in the city, moving through the crowds, anonymous and unseen, the killer was already planning his next act. Chapter 9. The Inquest at the Working Lads Institute. The Working Lads Institute stood on Whitechapel Road, a solid Victorian building dedicated to the improvement and education of the young men of the East End. Its lecture halls hosted classes in reading and arithmetic. Its library offered books to those who could not afford them. Its meeting rooms served as gathering places for the countless societies and associations that sought to lift the working classes toward respectability. On most days, the Institute was a place of quiet self-improvement, of earnest effort and modest hope. But on the 1st of September 1888, the Institute served a different purpose. Its largest room had been requisitioned for an inquest, a formal inquiry into the death of Mary Ann Nichols, and the space that usually held lectures on mechanics or geography now held the machinery of legal procedure. A coroner's desk, a witness stand, seats for the jury, benches for the press and the public. The coroner was Wynne Edwin Baxter, a man of considerable experience and sharp intelligence. Baxter had presided over hundreds of inquests during his career, had heard testimony in cases ranging from industrial accidents to domestic murders, and he approached each case with the same methodical thoroughness. He was not a man easily shocked, not a man given to sensationalism, but he understood that this case was different. The public attention was intense, the circumstances were unusual, and the wounds inflicted on the victim suggested a killer of particular danger. The jury had been impaneled the day before, a group of local men called to fulfill their civic duty, to hear the evidence and render a verdict on the cause and manner of death. They had been taken to the mortuary to view the body, a standard procedure that was meant to impress upon them the gravity of their task. Several of the jurors had been visibly shaken by what they saw: the throat wounds, the abdominal mutilations, the ruined body of a woman who had been alive just days before. The inquest began with the formal identification of the deceased. Edward Walker, Polly's father, took the stand and confirmed that the body in the mortuary was that of his daughter, Mary Ann Nichols, called Polly. He was 70 years old, a retired smith, and he spoke with the careful dignity of a man determined to maintain his composure in the face of tragedy. He gave the basic facts of her life: her birth in 1845, her marriage to William Nichols, her separation, her descent into poverty. He did not speculate on the circumstances of her death. He did not express anger or grief. He simply answered the questions put to him and then stepped down. William Nichols followed, the estranged husband, a man who had not seen his wife in years but who was still legally bound to her. He confirmed the facts of their marriage and separation, explained the cessation of his maintenance payments, and expressed what might have been regret or might have been merely the appropriate sentiment for the occasion. He had not wished her ill, he said. He had simply washed his hands of her when she refused to change her way of life. The medical testimony was the heart of the inquest. Dr. Llewellyn took the stand and described, in clinical detail, the wounds he'd observed on the body. The throat had been cut twice, he said, with a strong-bladed knife drawn from left to right. The cuts had severed the windpipe, the gullet, and the major blood vessels on both sides of the neck. Death would have been rapid, almost instantaneous, the blood draining from the body within minutes. But it was the abdominal wounds that drew the most attention. Llewellyn described a long, jagged incision running down the centre of the abdomen, deep enough to penetrate the peritoneum and expose the intestines. He described several other cuts, made apparently at random, slashing across the flesh. These wounds had been inflicted after death, he believed, or at least after the victim had lost consciousness from blood loss. They served no purpose except mutilation. The knife, Llewellyn estimated, must have been at least 6 inches long, with a strong, sharp blade. The cut suggested a certain anatomical knowledge, not necessarily the knowledge of a surgeon or a butcher, but at least a familiarity with the human body that went beyond the ordinary. The killer had known where to cut, had known how to cut, had wielded his blade with confidence and precision. The jurors listened with growing unease. This was not the kind of evidence they were accustomed to hearing, not a tale of drunken violence or jealous rage, but something colder, more deliberate, more disturbing. The mutilation suggested a mind that could not be understood in ordinary terms, a purpose that eluded rational explanation. Who would do such a thing, and why? The witnesses from Bucks Row told their stories next. Charles Cross, the carman who had first discovered the body, described his early morning walk to work, his initial impression that the figure in the street was a tarpaulin, his growing realization that it was a woman. He had not seen anyone else in the street, had not heard any sounds of struggle or distress. The night had been quiet, the darkness complete. Robert Paul, the second carman, corroborated this account. He had felt for a heartbeat, he said, and thought he detected something. A faint flutter, perhaps. the last traces of life departing. But he could not be certain. It had been dark, and he had been frightened, and his hands had been unsteady. Police Constable Neal described his discovery of the body, his examination by lantern light, his immediate recognition that the wounds were severe. He had blown his whistle for assistance, had secured the scene as best he could, had waited for the doctor to arrive. He too had seen no one suspicious, had heard nothing unusual. The killer had vanished into the night without leaving a trace. The testimony continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Other witnesses were called: the lodging house deputy from Thrall Street, Emily Holland, who had spoken to Polly just hours before her death, residents of Bucks Row who had been awakened by the commotion. Each added a small piece to the puzzle, but none could provide the crucial information that the investigation needed. No one had seen the killer. No one had witnessed the attack. No one could offer any explanation for what had happened in that dark street in the small hours of the morning. Coroner Baxter conducted his examination with characteristic thoroughness. He pressed the witnesses for details, asked probing questions, sought to establish a precise timeline of events. He was particularly interested in the question of whether Polly might have been killed elsewhere, and her body moved to Bucks Row, a theory that would later be definitively rejected. The quantity of blood on the street made it clear that she had died where she was found. The inquest was adjourned on that first day, to be resumed later as additional evidence emerged. The jury would eventually return a verdict of willful murder by some person or persons unknown, the standard formulation when no suspect could be identified. But that verdict lay days in the future. For now, the investigation was just beginning, and the questions far outnumbered the answers. The press coverage was extensive. The newspapers of London devoted columns to the murder, printing detailed accounts of the inquest testimony, publishing illustrations of Bucks Row and the Working Lads Institute, speculating about the identity and motives of the killer. The sensationalism was restrained. As yet, the full horror of what was to come had not yet been revealed. But there was already a sense that this case was different, that it demanded attention, that it spoke to something deep and troubling about the city and its hidden corners. The East London Observer, the East London Advertiser and the London Times all carried extensive reports. The Illustrated Police News prepared engravings for its next edition, artists sketching scenes they had not witnessed, imagining the darkness of Bucks Row and the face of the victim. The coverage would only intensify in the weeks to come as the killer struck again and the pattern became unmistakable. But for now, in the first days of September 1888, there was only one victim and one mystery. The police of H Division pursued their inquiries, interviewing lodging house residents, searching for the weapon, following leads that led nowhere. Inspector Spratling coordinated the investigation, though his resources were limited and his experience with crimes of this nature was nil. The Metropolitan Police had no detectives assigned to the case initially. That would come later as the scope of the threat became clear. The residents of Whitechapel went about their lives with a new wariness. The women who walked the streets were more cautious now, more reluctant to go with strangers, more inclined to work in pairs or stay in well-lit areas. But they could not stop working altogether. They needed the money, needed the fourpence for a bed, needed to survive. And so they continued, night after night, taking the same risks that Polly Nichols had taken, hoping that lightning would not strike twice. In the Working Lads Institute, the coroner's inquiry had revealed the bare facts of a death, but not the meaning behind it. The wounds spoke of hatred or madness, or something that had no name. The precision spoke of planning, of purpose, of a mind that had thought carefully about what it wanted to do. The anonymity spoke of a killer who could move through the streets of Whitechapel without attracting notice, who looked like anyone else, who might be anyone at all. The inquest would resume, the testimony would continue, the verdict would eventually be rendered, but the larger questions, who and why and what came next, remained unanswered. They would remain unanswered for days and weeks and months and years. They remain unanswered still. Polly Nichols lay in the mortuary, her wounds documented, her identity confirmed, her story nearly complete. Soon she would be buried, return to the earth from which she had come. Soon her name would be joined by others, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, Kelly, women who would die in the same terrible way, victims of the same unknown hand. But for now she was alone in death, as she had been alone in life, the first of the Canonical 5, the beginning of the Autumn of Terror, and the killer, somewhere in the city, was already thinking about the next. From Chapter 10, The Burial at Little Ilford. The morning of September 6th dawned grey over London, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but did not yet deliver. The summer had finally broken, and the air carried the first hint of autumn, a coolness that whispered of the months to come. In the East End the markets opened as usual, the costermongers calling their wares, the traffic filling the streets with the rumble of wheels and the clatter of hooves. Life went on, as it always went on, indifferent to the passing of any single soul. At the mortuary on Old Montague Street, preparations were underway for the final journey of Mary Ann Nichols. The body had been examined, documented, identified, and now it was time for burial. The coffin was simple, made of elm, unadorned by any of the elaborate decorations that might grace the funeral of a wealthier person. The name was inscribed on a small plate, Mary Ann Nichols, age 42, though in fact she had been 43, a small error that no one thought to correct. The funeral had been arranged by her father, Edward Walker, with what funds he could spare. It was not an elaborate affair. There would be no procession of carriages, no crowds of mourners, no eulogies delivered in sonorous tones. There would only be a few family members, a brief service, and a grave in the cemetery at Little Ilford, in the eastern suburbs where the city gave way to fields and the air was cleaner than it had been in the streets where Polly had spent her final years. The coffin was loaded onto a hearse in the early morning, before the crowds could gather. There had been considerable public interest in the case, and the authorities feared that a public funeral might attract sightseers, might turn into a spectacle rather than a solemn occasion. The route was kept quiet, the timing unpublicised, the proceedings conducted with deliberate discretion. But word had spread, as word always spreads. By the time the hearse began its journey eastward, a small crowd had gathered outside the mortuary, watching in silence as the coffin emerged. These were the people of Whitechapel, the lodging-house residents, the street walkers, the shopkeepers who had known Polly by sight if not by name. They watched with expressions that mingled curiosity and sorrow, and something like fear. If it could happen to her, it could happen to any of them. The knowledge sat heavy in the air, unspoken but understood. The hearse moved slowly through the streets, past the lodging-houses where Polly had lived, past the public houses where she had drunk, past the corners where she had waited for clients in the endless pursuit of fourpence. The route took her through the heart of the world she had inhabited, a final tour of the geography of her poverty. Then the buildings thinned, the streets widened, and the city fell away behind them. Little Ilford was a quiet place, a village that had not yet been swallowed by London's relentless expansion. The cemetery there served the eastern parishes, receiving the dead of Whitechapel and Stepney and Bow, the poor and the forgotten whose families could not afford plots in the more fashionable burial grounds closer to the city centre. The graves were marked with simple headstones, if they were marked at all, and the grass grew long between them, tended only sporadically by the groundskeepers. The grave had been dug the day before, a neat rectangular hole in the earth, waiting to receive its occupant. The soil here was clay, heavy and dark, and it would hold Polly Nichols for as long as the earth endured. The grave diggers had done their work with the same routine efficiency that attended all their tasks. One grave was much like another. The dead did not complain. The mourners were few. Edward Walker was there, the elderly father who had tried and failed to save his daughter from herself. He stood at the graveside with the stiffness of a man unused to grief, or perhaps too familiar with it. His face revealed little, but his presence spoke of the bond that had survived all the years of estrangement, all the disappointments, all the unanswered questions. She was still his daughter. She would always be his daughter. There may have been others, siblings perhaps, or neighbours from the streets where Polly had grown up. The records do not specify who attended, and the newspapers, having devoted columns to the murder and the inquest, paid little attention to the burial. A funeral was not news. A funeral was simply the end of a story that had already been told. The service was brief, the words familiar from 1,000 other burials, the liturgy of the Church of England providing a framework for the disposal of the dead. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection. The phrases rolled out over the open grave, offering what comfort they could to those who remained. Whether anyone found comfort in them is impossible to say. The dead are beyond comfort, and the living must find their own way through grief. The coffin was lowered into the earth. The ropes creaked as the gravediggers paid them out hand over hand, until the elm box came to rest at the bottom of the hole. The first handfuls of soil were scattered over the lid, the sound hollow and final. Then the shovels went to work and the grave began to fill, and Mary Ann Nichols disappeared beneath the weight of the earth that would be her final home. The mourners dispersed. The hearse returned to the city. The gravediggers finished their work, mounding the soil over the grave, tamping it down with the backs of their shovels. They did not erect a headstone immediately. That would come later, if it came at all. For now, there was only the fresh-turned earth, distinguishable from the older graves around it by its colour and its shape, but soon enough to blend into the general landscape of the dead. The clouds that had threatened all morning finally opened, and rain began to fall over Little Ilford. It fell on the new grave and the old graves, on the paths between them and the chapel at the centre of the cemetery. It fell on the city to the west, washing the streets of Whitechapel, filling the gutters, driving the pedestrians to seek shelter in doorways and under awnings. The rain did not discriminate. It fell on the rich and the poor, the living and the dead, the guilty and the innocent. In the streets of Whitechapel, life continued. The lodging houses filled as evening came on, the women paying their fourpence and claiming their beds. The public houses did their usual trade, the gin flowing, the conversations rising and falling in the familiar rhythms of the neighbourhood. The police walked their beats, their eyes more watchful now, their minds alert for anything unusual. They had not caught the killer. They did not know who he was or where he would strike next. They knew only that he was out there, somewhere, and that their job had become infinitely more difficult. The newspapers continued to publish their accounts, feeding the public appetite for information and speculation. The name Jack the Ripper had not yet been coined. That would come later, in a letter that may or may not have been genuine. But the sense of a singular menace was already taking shape. This was not random violence. This was something else, something with a pattern and a purpose, something that would strike again. And it did strike again, less than a week later. Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street on the morning of September the 8th. Her body mutilated in ways that made the wounds of Polly Nichols seem almost restrained. The autumn of terror had truly begun, and it would claim more victims before it ended. Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, each death adding to the legend, each wound deepening the mystery. But Polly Nichols was the first. She was the one who opened the door to the nightmare, the one whose death announced that something new and terrible had arrived in the streets of London. Her name would be remembered when so many others were forgotten. Her story told and retold as the first chapter in a tale that has never truly ended. She did not choose this immortality. She did not want it. She wanted only fourpence for a bed, a few hours of sleep, a chance to survive until morning. The grave at Little Ilford has weathered more than a century of seasons now. The headstone, erected eventually by unknown hands, has been worn by rain and wind and the slow erosion of time. The inscription is difficult to read, the letters fading into the stone. But the grave is still there, still visited occasionally by those who remember, still holding the remains of a woman who was nobody special, who lived and suffered and died in the shadows of the greatest city on earth. The candle has burned low, the night has grown quiet. The story of Polly Nichols has been told, from her birth in the lanes of Fleet Street to her death on the cobblestones of Bucks Row, from the workhouse years to the lodging houses of Whitechapel, from the brief hope of her marriage to the long despair of her final decade. She was a wife, a mother, a daughter, a woman who tried and failed and tried again, a woman who was failed by every institution that should have protected her. She was also the first victim of the most infamous killer in history, a distinction she never sought and could never have imagined. Her death made her famous in a way, but it was the fame of tragedy, of loss, of a life reduced to a single terrible night. She deserved better. They all deserved better. The rain falls still over Little Ilford, over Whitechapel, over the city that has changed so much and so little since that autumn of 1888. The streets where Polly walked have been rebuilt, the lodging houses demolished, the stable yards paved over and forgotten. But something remains, some echo of her presence, some whisper of her story in the darkness. She was here, she lived, she mattered, and now she sleeps, beneath the English earth, in the quiet of a cemetery that few people visit. The chamber has fallen silent, the hour is late, and history, once again, has turned its page in the dark. Rest well, dear listener. Let the night carry you gently toward morning. And remember, if you will, the women who walked these streets so long ago, the women who had no one to remember them, the women whose names we speak now only because of how they died. Remember Polly Nichols. Remember them all. Good night.